If you can't order, you have to leave.
No one in the room came to her defense.
I find myself a little short a coin today.
She asked for no charity.
This isn't a charity ward.
Still, no one moved.
Papa, she looks like Grandma did.
It was all Arthur had left.
2 quarters, 50 cents.
Enough to feed his daughter or save a stranger from the Wyoming cold.
The lady is with us.
Every eye in the diner turned toward him.
You're paying for her?
Bring us 3 bowls of stew.
The winter of 1886-87 did not just arrive in Wyoming, it attacked. The sky turned into a sheet of lead. History would later call it the Great Die-Up, but for Arthur Vance, the world had already ended 2 hours ago. He stood on the edge of a frozen Cheyenne street. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets. His coat was thin and worn. It was far too old for this winter. Beside him stood Rosie. She was only 7 years old. She was his only reason to keep drawing breath in a world that had gone cold. Arthur had been the head foreman of the Miller cattle yard for 5 long, loyal years. He had survived stampedes that shook the earth. He had survived droughts that turned the prairie to dust. He had survived broken bones and the bite of rattlesnakes. Now, he was a pariah. He had been fired in disgrace. He had been branded a thief in front of every man he respected. He had stolen nothing. He had simply refused to lie for a man who wanted to profit from rot. But in the Old West, a man's reputation was his only currency. Arthur Vance was now bankrupt. The falling snow muffled all the town's sounds. The flakes were fat and wet. They clung to his eyelashes like frozen tears. Rosie's small hand was tucked firmly inside his own. Her skin felt like ice. She didn't ask why they weren't going back to their small shack. She didn't ask why the fire in their stove was out. She simply held on. "Are we going home, Papa?" Rosie asked softly. Her voice was barely audible over the wind. Arthur looked down at her. He saw her mother's eyes looking back. He saw Mary's gentle spirit in a face pale with hunger. The room they called home was gone. The landlord had seen the sheriff at the yard. He had made his choice instantly. He wanted no thieves under his roof. "We're going to find some warmth." "Rosie," Arthur whispered. His throat felt like it was filled with dry sand. Arthur pulled his worn collar tight against his neck. His hands were rough and calloused from years of honest toil. Right now, they held only 50 cents, 2 quarters. That was the total sum of his life's work. 50 cents to feed a growing girl. 50 cents to survive another night of deadly cold. He looked at Rosie's cheeks. They were red from the cold. Tomorrow could wait. Survival was a matter of the next hour. They stopped in front of a small building called Sarah's Hearth. It was a humble roadside eatery on the edge of the unforgiving town. Warm yellow light spilled through the frosted windows. It looked like a beacon in a sea of white. Inside, the smell of beef stew and wood smoke hit them like a memory. Arthur pushed the heavy oak door open. A small brass bell jingled sharply. The warmth of the room hit them like a physical embrace. It smelled of roasted animal fat and toasted sourdough. Cowboys and trail hands crowded the long wooden tables. They were loud and boisterous. They were oblivious to the tragedy standing in the doorway. Arthur's attention went to the corner. An elderly woman sat all alone. She was tucked away at a small, round table in the shadows. She wore a heavy, faded black coat. It looked as if it had been on the road. The fabric was frayed at the seams. The cuffs were stained by the gray dust of 1,000 miles. Her silver hair was tucked under a tattered wool shawl. She looked like a forgotten shadow in a room full of life. Arthur led Rosie to a small booth. He noticed the head waitress, Brenda. She was a woman hardened by the frontier. The brutal winter had stripped away her patience. She looked at the elderly woman in the corner and sneered. Brenda's eyes scanned the room for anyone who lacked the coin to be there. "Ma'am, You've been sitting there for 20 minutes, Brenda called out. Her voice was like a whip cracking against stone. The laughter in the diner died instantly. The men turned their heads to watch the easy prey. The elderly woman looked up slowly. Her movements were slow with nearly 70 years in them. Her blue eyes were cloudy, like a lake covered in morning fog. I find myself a little short of coin today, she admitted quietly. She spoke with a painful dignity. It made Arthur's heart ache. If you can't order, you have to leave, Brenda snapped. She wiped a grease-stained rag across her apron. This isn't a charity ward. I have paying customers who need that space. The room went deathly quiet. The cowboys looked at their plates. The trail drivers looked at the floor. In 1887, kindness was a luxury few could afford. Arthur felt a familiar, burning heat rising in his chest. It was the same heat he felt when he saw a man beat a horse. It was a slow simmer of righteous anger. He looked down at Rosie. She was staring at the old woman with wide, watery eyes. "Papa, she looks like Grandma did," Rosie whispered, before the winter took her away. Arthur thought of his own mother. She had died in a drafty cabin with nothing but a prayer on her lips. Then he thought of Mary, his late wife. Mary would have given her last crust of bread to a stranger. She had died bringing Rosie into this hard, cold world. Arthur remembered the feeling of utter helplessness when she passed. I would not stand by and watch another soul face the dark alone. Rosie squeezed his hand. Mama would have shared. Papa. Arthur stood up from the booth. His heavy boots echoed like thunder in the silence. "Waitress," Arthur called out. His voice was low and steady. It was the deep rumble of a coming storm. Brenda turned toward him with a sharp jerk of her chin. "The lady is with us," Arthur said firmly. He did not hesitate. He did not calculate the cost of his own survival. He pointed to the empty seat across from him and his daughter. Brenda's eyebrows shot up in mockery. "You're paying for her?" she asked. She looked at his frayed collar and his hollow eyes. "You don't look like you've got much to spare yourself, friend." Arthur didn't flinch. He stood tall. "That is none of your concern," he replied. "Bring us 3 bowls of the house stew, and whatever bread comes with it." He glanced at the old woman, and something hot for the lady to drink. The elderly woman looked at Arthur. A sudden light sharpened in those cloudy eyes. "Oh, no, sir, I couldn't possibly," she stammered. Arthur walked over to her table. He gently took her frail, shaking arm. "Please, ma'am," he said. His voice was a gentle rumble of comfort. "It would be a genuine honor for my daughter and me. No person should face the Wyoming wind on an empty stomach." He led her slowly to their booth. Rosie immediately slid over against the wall to make room. She patted the seat with a small, red-knuckled hand. "I'm Rosie," the little girl said with a shy smile. The old woman sat down heavily. Her bones creaked like old timber. "I am Martha," she replied. "It is a true pleasure to meet a lady like you, Rosie." Arthur reached into his pocket. He placed his last 50 cents on the rough wooden table. His fingers lingered on the coins for one heartbeat. He saw the face of the landlord. He saw the empty, freezing barn where they might sleep. Then he looked at Martha's trembling hands. He pushed the coins toward Brenda. He did not look back. Martha watched the coins slide across the table, and something in her expression changed. Not surprise, not gratitude, recognition. She looked from Arthur's empty hands to Rosie's thin coat. "You truly have nothing left after this." "Do you?" she asked. Arthur gave a small shrug. "We have tonight." Rosie tore her piece of bread in half and placed one piece beside Martha's bowl. "And we have enough to share tonight," she said. Martha stared at the bread as though Rosie had set a jewel before her. For a moment, the old woman's composure broke. Her eyes filled, but she lowered her face before the room could see. Arthur pretended not to notice. Dignity, he knew, was sometimes the last warm thing a person owned. Brenda returned with the hot drink and set it down harder than necessary. Her gaze lingered on the 2 quarters, then on Rosie's half-eaten bread, then on Martha. Something uncertain crossed her face, but it vanished almost at once. Arthur lifted his spoon. "Eat while it's hot, ma'am." Martha nodded. And for the first time since Arthur had entered Sarah's hearth, the old woman smiled. The stew arrived 10 minutes later. It was served in heavy, chipped ceramic bowls. Steam rolled up in thick, fragrant plumes. It smelled of rosemary and salt. It smelled like the very idea of home. Martha ate slowly. She moved with a grace that didn't suit her tattered clothes. She savored every drop. Arthur watched Rosie eat first. He pushed the largest chunks of beef into her bowl. "Eat up, Rosie," he said softly. "You need your strength for the walk." He focused on the warmth in his own stomach. His head drifted back to the cattle yard. He remembered the look on Miller's face. Miller had ordered him to sign off on a shipment of cheap lumber. He wanted hemlock and pine for the new pens. It was brittle wood. It would snap under the weight of a panicked steer. Arthur had refused. "I won't build a coffin for these animals," Arthur had said. Miller had smiled a serpent's smile. Then, a box of expensive brass nails vanished from the supply shed. Miller claimed he had found them in Arthur's saddlebag. Arthur knew they had been planted. That accusation was enough for Miller to fire him at once. By noon, Arthur had lost his job. By evening, the story had spread through the cattle yards. Arthur Vance was branded a thief. Miller had money and influence. Arthur had only his word, and 1887 was a terrible year to be without work. The winter that would be called the Great Die-Up tightened its hold on the range. Arthur's fear does not feel all that distant to me, even today. Plenty of families know how quickly losing a paycheck can turn groceries or a warm place to sleep into a real worry. Maybe that's why his choice stays with me. He had almost nothing, and he still made room for someone else. "You seem deeply troubled." "Arthur," Martha said quietly. Arthur shook his head to clear the shadows. "Just the weight of the world, ma'am." Martha sipped her tea. "I lost my husband last spring," she shared. "He was a man who loved this land more than he loved his own safety." Arthur nodded in solemn agreement. "My wife, Mary, was the same," he said. "She used to say a warm blanket was a prayer you could touch." Rosie reached into her small burlap bag. She pulled out a scrap of faded calico fabric. It was a piece of a log cabin pattern her mother had started. "I'm learning how to sew just like her," Rosie told Martha. The old woman's eyes softened with a deep, ancient understanding. For the next hour, the three of them talked like family. The roar of the diner faded into the background. Arthur told her of his dream. He wanted a small ranch. He wanted honest work. He wanted a place where Rosie could grow up without the shadow of a master. Martha listened with an intensity that Arthur found strange. She studied his face. She studied his hands. When the meal was finished, Martha stood up. She seemed taller now. Her posture was no longer bowed by the cold. "I must be going," she said. "My ride should be here any moment." Arthur looked out the window. There was nothing but a wall of white. "In God's eyes, Arthur, a man who feeds a stranger is richer than any king," Martha said. She touched Rosie's cheek with a feather-light hand. Arthur tipped his hat. "Safe travels, Martha." Rosie gave the woman an impulsive, fierce hug. Martha stepped out into the bitter evening. Her black coat fluttered like a raven's wing against the snow. Arthur watched her disappear into the swirling void. "All right, Rosie," he whispered. "Let's go find us a place to rest." They spent the night in a livery stable. They slept in the hay. They huddled together for warmth. The air smelled of dry clover and old leather. Arthur stayed awake. He listened to the wind scream against the rafters. He thought about the 50 cents. He didn't regret it. He felt a strange peace, even as his toes went numb. Sometime after midnight, Rosie stirred against his chest. "Papa, I'm here. Do you think Martha found her ride?" Arthur looked through a crack in the stable wall. Snow raced sideways through the darkness. "I hope she did." Rosie was quiet for a moment. Then she whispered, "I wish Grandma had found someone when she was cold." The words struck him harder than the wind. Arthur pulled the old horse blanket higher around Rosie's shoulders. "So do I, sweetheart. Maybe that's why we found Martha." Arthur did not answer. He had never been a man who claimed to understand God's plans. Understood cattle, weather, fences, and the weight of honest work. But with his daughter breathing softly against him, He allowed himself one small hope. Perhaps kindness did not have to fix the whole world to matter. Perhaps it only had to keep one person from facing the night alone. Rosie fell asleep again. Arthur remained awake until dawn, listening to the horses shift in their stalls. He had no job, no room, and not a cent left to his name. But when he remembered Martha holding Rosie's piece of bread, he still knew he had made the right choice. The next morning, the sun rose over a world made of glass. The town was buried in white. As they reached the main street, a massive black carriage appeared. It was pulled by 4 magnificent bay horses. The carriage bore a gold crest, the Sterling Cattle Company. The Sterling Cattle Company was one of the largest outfits in Wyoming territory. Arthur had heard the Sterling name all his working life. The carriage stopped directly in front of Arthur. A man in a fine wool suit stepped out. "I am Silas Thorne, executor for the Sterling estate," the man said. "Mrs. Sterling would like to see you at the ranch immediately." Arthur stared at him. "I don't know any Mrs. Sterling." "She says you bought her lunch yesterday," Thorne replied with a small, knowing smile. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. Martha, the forgotten widow he had fed with his last 50 cents, was Martha Sterling. She was the woman behind one of Wyoming's largest cattle empires. The carriage ride took them beyond the last buildings of Cheyenne and into open country buried beneath white. Rosie pressed close to the window. She had never ridden on velvet seats or beneath a roof lined with polished wood. Arthur barely noticed the luxury. His eyes were on the land. Fence posts leaned under the weight of ice. Several cattle stood with their backs to the wind, ribs visible beneath their winter coats. A wagon loaded with hay had overturned beside a drift, and 2 ranch hands were struggling to free it. Arthur's foreman's instincts stirred before he could stop them. "Those cattle need to be moved," he murmured. Thorne looked across at him. "Moved where?" Arthur pointed toward a dark break in the distant hills. "Those canyons. The wind will pass over the rim instead of cutting straight through the herd." Thorne studied him. "Our manager says moving them now would waste manpower. Leaving them there will waste cattle." The executor said nothing after that, but Arthur noticed him glance toward the herd again. Rosie leaned against her father's arm. "Are we in trouble, Papa?" Arthur looked down at her. "I don't know yet." He squeezed her hand. "But whatever happens, we tell the truth." Rosie nodded as though that settled everything. Outside, the Sterling ranch stretched farther than Arthur could see. It was wealth on a scale he had never imagined. Yet beneath the snow, he could already see neglect, and for the first time, he wondered why Martha Sterling had really brought him there. They were driven in luxury to a manor on the hill. It sat there like a fortress. Martha was waiting on the porch. She was dressed in deep blue silk. Her silver hair sat like a crown. "Welcome to Sterling Ranch, Arthur," she said. Arthur looked at his mud-stained boots. "I had no idea." "Ma'am." Martha walked down the steps. "Since my husband died, I have found that money hides the truth," she said. "I wanted to see how the world treats a woman with nothing." She looked at him with the fierce pride of a mother. "Most ignored me. Brenda was ready to send me back into the storm. You were the only one who had nothing and still gave everything." She handed him a ledger. "I had Thorne look into your dismissal at the Miller yard." Arthur opened the book. The supply ledger showed that Miller himself had signed for the brass nails. He had done it shortly before accusing Arthur. "A stable boy saw him plant them," Martha said. "The sheriff is at Miller's office right now. Thorne also spoke to men who worked beside you for years. Not one of them questioned your ability with cattle. Your name is clear, Arthur." He felt he could breathe for the first time in days. "But that isn't why you are here," Martha continued. "My manager is a man of greed. He is letting my cattle die because he refuses to work in the cold. I am firing him this afternoon. I want a man with a spine to lead Sterling. I want you." "Arthur." Arthur gasped. "Ma'am, that's a job for a man of status." "No," Martha said, her voice like iron. "It's a job for a man of character. You will have the foreman's house, and Rosie will have a good education in Cheyenne." Arthur looked at Rosie. She was already looking at the massive house with wonder. "Can we stay, Papa?" Arthur took Martha's hand and bowed his head. "I accept, ma'am." Arthur did not move into the foreman's house that afternoon. First, He asked to see the barns. Martha raised one silver eyebrow. You have a warm bed waiting, and you want to inspect hay. Warm beds don't keep cattle alive, ma'am. That answer pleased her. For the next 3 hours, Arthur walked the ranch with Thorne. He checked feed stores and water access. He walked fence lines and every sheltered draw before dark. There was hay, but too much of it had been stored where drifting snow could block the doors. The strongest cattle had been given the easiest feed. Weaker animals were left exposed. The ranch had resources. What it lacked was preparation. At supper, Martha asked him what he intended to do. Arthur did not soften the truth. We stopped pretending money can frighten winter away. He spread a rough map across the table. We moved the weakest stock first. We opened the South Canyon. We put men on the wells before sunrise. And we rationed the hay now. Not when the barns are half empty. Martha listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "My late husband would have liked you." Arthur lowered his eyes. I'd rather earn that judgment than inherit it. Across the table, Rosie was fighting sleep over a bowl of pudding. Martha smiled at her. "Tomorrow, young lady, we will see about lessons." Rosie blinked awake. "School and sewing, if you still want to learn." Rosie looked at Arthur as if someone had handed her the moon. That was the moment the offer became real to him. Not the house, not the salary. His daughter had a tomorrow again. For a father who had spent the night before wondering where his child would sleep, that promise meant more than any pay Martha could offer. That evening, Arthur carried Rosie's small bag into the foreman's house. The rooms were plain, but to Rosie they might as well have belonged to a queen. There was a real bed beneath the window. There was a washstand with a porcelain basin. There was even a little iron stove that held its heat through the night. Rosie stood in the doorway and did not move. "Is this really ours, Papa?" Arthur remembered her question in the snow. "Are we going home?" "Papa." Only one night had passed, yet it felt like another lifetime. Arthur swallowed before answering. "Yes, sweetheart. This is home now." Rosie walked to the bed and pressed both hands into the quilt. Then she looked back at him. "Mama would have liked this room." Arthur turned toward the stove so his daughter would not see his face. Han had spent 7 years trying to be both father and mother to Rosie. Some nights, he still wondered whether he had been enough. For years. Every good thing felt smaller because Mary was not there to share it. A quiet knock came at the open door. Martha stood in the hall holding a folded wool blanket. "I thought the child might need another layer tonight." Arthur took it carefully. "Mrs. Sterling, you've already done more than enough." Martha shook her head. "No, Arthur. You gave me something yesterday that money could not buy." He looked at her. "What was that?" "The chance to believe people can still surprise me." Rosie climbed onto the bed and pulled the blanket over her knees. "Then maybe we surprised each other." Martha laughed softly. Arthur did too. It was the first time in many months that laughter had entered a room he called his own. 2 days later, Arthur rode back to the Miller yard. He wasn't looking for a job. I was delivering a notice. The sheriff's investigation had already begun. Sterling was ending every contract with Miller. Arthur didn't gloat. For days, he had imagined how victory might feel. Standing there, he discovered that revenge felt smaller than getting his daughter's future back. He simply looked Miller in the eye. "A man's name is all he takes to the grave," Arthur said. "You should have guarded yours better." Arthur spent the next weeks preparing. Everyone else hoped the winter would simply pass. He divided the hands into crews. One cleared trails to the sheltered canyons. Another hauled hay before the drifts could bury the wagon roads. A third repaired weak fences and marked water holes that could be opened quickly after a freeze. Arthur worked beside every crew. He never asked a man to lift what he would not lift himself. Some of the older hands resisted him at first. They had seen managers arrive in clean coats, give orders from porches, and disappear when the weather turned cruel. Arthur was different. When a wagon axle snapped in the dark, he lay in the snow beside the wheel until it was repaired. When a young hand named Eli lost feeling in his fingers, Arthur sent him inside and took his place. By the end of the second week, the men no longer called him Martha's charity case. They called him Foreman. One evening, Thorne brought a telegram from Cheyenne. Miller had been formally charged in connection with the stolen supplies and falsified records. Arthur read it once and folded it carefully. Martha expected relief. Instead, he walked to the fire and stood there quietly. "You waited a long time for that," she said. Arthur nodded. "I thought hearing it would give me back what he took." "Didn't it?" Arthur looked toward the room where Rosie was laughing over a sewing lesson. "It gave me my name back, but Rosie never stopped believing it belonged to me." Then he looked around the warm house. "But this reminded me I was more than a name, even when people thought the worst of me." Martha's eyes softened. "That is a lesson some rich men never learn." Arthur tucked the telegram into his coat. The next morning, he was back outside before dawn. That winter became one of the hardest the cattle country had ever known. Herds across the open range were devastated. Arthur worked beside the Sterling hands through bitter nights. They moved the weakest cattle into sheltered canyons. They broke ice wherever water could still be reached. Sterling still suffered losses. Every ranch did, but Arthur's preparation saved far more of the herd than anyone had expected. The worst storm arrived without ceremony. By afternoon, the horizon vanished. Snow swallowed the fence lines and turned men standing 20 feet apart into shadows. Arthur ordered the south herd toward the canyon. The cattle resisted, spooked by the wind and the white wall of the storm ahead, for hours. Arthur and the ranch hands rode along the edges of the herd, turning animals away from deep drifts and keeping calves close to their mothers. Near dusk, a young calf went down. One of the hands shouted that they had to leave it. Arthur looked at the sky. He knew the man was right. Then he saw the cow standing over her calf, refusing to move. "Give me the rope." 2 men helped him pull the calf onto a feed sled. They reached the canyon after dark. They did lose a few that night. Arthur never pretended otherwise. But hundreds of animals were alive because Arthur and the Sterling hands had moved the herd before the storm closed the range. When Arthur finally returned to the house, ice covered his coat. His hands were too stiff to unbutton it. Rosie ran toward him. She stopped only when Martha caught her shoulder. "Let your father breathe, child," Arthur laughed weakly. Rosie ignored the warning and wrapped both arms around his waist. "I knew you'd come back. You always come back for me." Arthur closed his eyes. For one heartbeat, he remembered Mary. Then he felt Martha place a warm blanket around his shoulders. Rosie looked up at her. "Is that one of your quilts?" Martha smiled. "No, sweetheart, but someday we'll make one worthy of this house." Arthur looked at the 2 of them and understood something that frightened him more than the storm. He had begun to think of Sterling as more than the place that employed him. It was the place where his daughter belonged. The next morning, Rosie found Arthur at the kitchen table before sunrise. His coat was drying near the stove and his hands were wrapped in clean cloth. She climbed onto the chair beside him. "Did it hurt? A little? Were you scared?" Arthur looked towards the dark window. He could have told her that grown men were not supposed to be afraid. Instead, he told her the truth. "Yes." Rosie seemed surprised. "But you still went. Being brave doesn't mean the fear goes away." He touched her nose with one finger. "It means you decide what matters more." Martha had entered quietly behind them. She set 2 cups on the table and watched Arthur a long moment. "My husband used to say something very much like that." Arthur lowered his eyes. "I hope I'm not taking his place." "You aren't." Martha sat across from him. "No one takes the place of the people we lose." She glanced toward Rosie. "But sometimes life makes room beside the empty chair." Arthur looked at his daughter. Rosie was tracing the rim of her cup with one finger. For the first time, he understood that healing did not require forgetting Mary. It did not ask him to leave the past behind. It simply asked him to let warmth return without feeling guilty for it. Rosie reached across the table and took Martha's hand. Martha squeezed back. No one said the word family. They did not need to. His hands were raw from the frozen iron and the wind. But in the evenings, he returned to a house filled with warmth. One night, a knock came to the door. It was Brenda. She was shivering. Her face was etched with the lines of true desperation. She had lost her job at the diner. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered into the snow. Brenda lowered her eyes. "But that isn't why I came. I came to tell you I was wrong. I knew what hunger felt like, and I still chose to humiliate you. I'm sorry. Mrs. Miss Sterling. Martha looked at the woman who had tried to cast her out. Why now? Brenda, Martha asked. Brenda swallowed hard. Because losing my place made me understand what I had done to you. Fear makes people cruel, Brenda, Martha said softly. But mercy makes them human. We need a hand in the kitchen. Martha stepped aside and opened the door wider. For one trembling second, Brenda remained in the snow. Then she crossed the threshold. Brenda wept with relief that shook her whole body. Spring eventually softened the frozen ground. The surviving cattle began to put weight back on. Arthur expected the ranch to celebrate with numbers. Martha surprised him. She ordered the old bunkhouse beside the south road repaired. Brenda helped turn one room into a kitchen. Rosie painted a small wooden sign with uneven letter, "Hot soup for travelers." Arthur stared at it. Where did you get that idea? Rosie looked offended by the question. From you. The first visitor was an old freight driver whose wagon had lost a wheel. The second was a mother traveling west with 2 tired children. When the mother reached for her purse, Brenda gently shook her head. The meal is already paid for. By whom, the woman asked. Brenda glanced through the doorway toward Arthur. By someone who once had only 50 cents. No one asked how much money they carried. No one asked whether they could repay the meal. One evening, Arthur stood in the doorway while Brenda ladled stew into chipped bowls. The smell of rosemary carried him back to Sarah's hearth. Brenda noticed. You thinking about that night? Arthur nodded. She looked down at the ladle. I wish I could take back the woman I was. You can't. Brenda's face tightened. Arthur continued, Duh. But you can decide who you are the next time somebody hungry walks through the door. Brenda looked toward Rosie, who was teaching a traveler's child a simple stitch. Then she smiled. Outside. Martha sat beneath the porch roof with a blanket across her knees. She watched the little rest house glow in the evening. What began with 50 cents is getting expensive, she called. Arthur smiled. I'll pay you back. Martha shook her head. You already did. Arthur looked at Rosie. Brenda, and the strangers eating without shame. Only then did he understand what Martha meant. And what began during one terrible winter slowly became a tradition at Sterling Ranch. Years passed. The ranch flourished under Arthur's steady hand. Martha became the grandmother Rosie had lost. Rosie became the granddaughter Martha had never had. Arthur remained at Sterling through good years and bad. He kept the fences and fields as though they were his own. When Martha finally passed away at 92, she left the Sterling estate in their care. Rosie found Martha's old wool shawl folded carefully beside her bed. She held it against her chest and wept for the grandmother life had given her. Arthur stood beside her in silence. Some debts, he knew, were never meant to be repaid. They were meant to be carried forward. Arthur stood on the porch, looking out over the vast hills. He was an old man now. His hair was as white as that terrible winter of 1887. Rosie stood beside him. She placed a hand on his shoulder. It's a beautiful empire, Papa, she said. Arthur smiled. His eyes were misty with the memory of an old woman in a faded black coat. It's not an empire, Rosie, he replied. It's a home. And it all started with a simple bowl of stew. Arthur looked toward the setting sun. For a moment, he could almost smell rosemary and wood smoke again. Kindness had cost him 50 cents on the darkest night of his life. What followed was something no amount of money could have bought. A family, a name restored, and finally, a home. Thank you for walking this trail with us. If Arthur, Rosie, and Martha touched your heart, subscribe and join us for the next story from the Old West. And remember, even when the world feels cold, kindness is never wasted.